I died. 6 years into my marriage to the Pei family, on a bitterly cold day in early winter. The sky that day was the color of ash, heavy with clouds that seemed to press down on the entire capital. A thin layer of frost covered everything, the courtyard stones, the bare branches of the locust tree, the rooftops of the Pei estate. Winter had arrived early that year, as if heaven itself wanted to add its cold cruelty to the day's events. I remember every detail with a clarity that haunts me still. The rough hemp ropes binding my wrists, cutting into my skin with every struggle. The splintered wood of the execution cage pressing against my back. The biting wind that sliced through my thin prison clothes like 1,000 tiny knives. And above all, the faces. My husband, Pei Wenxuan, stood before me in his official's robes, immaculate and composed. That gentle and refined top scholar, the man I had loved, trusted, and built a life with for 6 years. His hands, the same hands that had once brushed hair from my face, that had held our newborn son, were now pushing me toward death. He watched me sink beneath the water, not a trace of pity in his eyes. Not a flicker. Not a single moment of hesitation. I searched his face desperately, even as the water rose to my chest, hoping to find something, regret, sorrow, guilt. Anything that would tell me the past 6 years had meant something to him. There was nothing. His expression was calm, composed, almost bored. Like he was watching a servant sweep the courtyard. Like I was nothing. But what truly made me die with my eyes wide open was my 5-year-old son, Pei Yuan. They had dragged him from the nursery, his little legs kicking uselessly against the strong arms of the servants who held him. His face was streaked with tears, his small body shaking with sobs. Mother! Mother! His voice, high and terrified, cut through me like a blade. 2 servants held him down, forcing him to watch as I disappeared beneath the surface. Those clear eyes of his, so like his father's in shape but so unlike in everything that mattered, they were filled with boundless hatred. Not just at the servants holding him. Not just at his father standing coldly by. But at the world itself, for allowing this to happen. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him to look away, to close his eyes, to remember me smiling, not like this. But the water was already filling my mouth, my nose, my lungs. The last thing I saw before darkness took me was my son's face. And the last thing I felt was not fear, not pain. It was rage. Pure, burning, undying rage. Chapter 2, The Afterlife. Later, I learned that the afterlife is worse than living. I had always imagined death as an ending. A release. A peaceful drifting into nothingness. I was wrong. I became a wandering ghost, trapped above the Pei estate, unable to leave anywhere. Some invisible tether bound me to that place, to the scene of my murder, to the people who had destroyed me. At first, I didn't understand why. I floated through walls, through courtyards, through the rooms where I had once lived and loved. No one could see me. No one could hear me. I was nothing, a whisper of smoke, a breath of wind, less than a shadow. The living went about their lives as if I had never existed. And that was the first torture. To be so completely erased. To watch the world continue spinning as if I had never laughed, never loved, never held my son in my arms. But the true torture was yet to come. Chapter 3, The Wedding. 7 days after my death, they held the wedding. I watched from above as my dear cousin Lu Rumei emerged from her chambers in full bridal splendor. She wore my bridal phoenix crown, the one my mother had spent her life savings on, the one with genuine gold filigree and pearls the size of peas. She wore my embroidered gown, the one I had spent a year stitching myself, every thread infused with hope for my married life. She walked down the same aisle I had walked 6 years earlier. She bowed to the same ancestors I had bowed to. She entered the same bridal chamber I had entered as a trembling, hopeful bride. And my husband, my murderer, lifted her red veil with the same hands that had pushed me to my death. I screamed. I screamed until my spectral throat tore, until no sound remained, until I collapsed into myself like a dying star. They couldn't hear me. They would never hear me. Lu Rumei smiled up at Pei Wenxuan with demure satisfaction, and he gazed back at her with something I had never seen in his eyes when he looked at me, warmth. Real warmth. Not the polite, distant affection he had always shown me. Not the dutiful husband act he had performed for 6 years. But genuine, heartfelt warmth. That was when I understood. I had never been his wife. I had only been a stepping stone. Lu Rumei was the woman he had always wanted. I was just the convenient bride from a respectable family, the one who would give him connections and produce an heir before being disposed of. The realization hit me harder than drowning ever had. Chapter 4, The Locust Tree. After the wedding, I couldn't bear to watch them anymore. I drifted to the courtyard where the old locust tree stood, the same tree where I used to sit with Yuan'er in summer, telling him stories while we ate chilled melon. What I found there destroyed me. My 5-year-old son was tied to the tree like a dog. Rough ropes bound his small wrists to a low-hanging branch, forcing him to sit on the frozen ground. His thin clothes, summer clothes, because no one had thought to give him winter garments, were soaked through with melting frost. Bone-chilling wind cut through him, and his small body shook uncontrollably. Not a drop of water. Not a grain of rice. For days. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His eyes, once so bright and curious, were dull with hunger and cold. But when a servant passed by with a bowl of steaming porridge, he didn't beg. He just watched. Watched with those eyes that I now realized held something new, patience. The patience of someone who knew he couldn't fight now, but who was waiting. Waiting for the day he could. I floated down beside him, desperately trying to wrap my spectral arms around his small body. He shivered, but not because of me, he couldn't feel my presence. He shivered because he was freezing to death, and no one cared. Yuan'er, I whispered. Yuan'er, Mama is here. Nothing. He couldn't hear me. I tried again and again, until my voice broke and my spectral form flickered with exhaustion. Nothing. I sat beside him through that first night, and the next, and the next. Watching. Waiting. Hating. Chapter 5, The Fever. The fever came on the 5th day. I watched it take hold of my son's small body, first a flush in his cheeks, then a tremor in his limbs, then the terrible heat that radiated from his skin even through his frozen clothes. By nightfall, he was burning. His small body, already weakened by hunger and cold, couldn't fight it. He tossed and turned on the frozen ground, delirious, calling out for me in his fever dreams. Mama. Mama, I'm cold. Mama, where are you? Mama, I'll be good, please come back. I screamed for help. I screamed until my spectral voice tore apart and reformed and tore apart again. I threw myself at every servant who passed by, trying to make them see, trying to make them care. No one noticed. No one stopped. No one gave a single thought to the dying child tied to a tree in the frozen courtyard. On the 3rd night of the fever, Lu Rumei's son, a fat, spoiled child of 7, wandered into the courtyard with his nursemaid. He saw Yuan'er tied to the tree and laughed. Look! The bastard's still here. He picked up a handful of frozen mud and threw it at Yuan'er's face. Yuan'er, too weak to even flinch, let it hit him. The nursemaid laughed too. Master Pei said to let him learn his place. A few more days, and he'll understand who matters in this household. They left. I stayed. I stayed and watched my son burn with fever, watched him shake with chills, watched him slowly, agonizingly, begin to die. And I made a vow. If he survived, I would watch over him forever. If he died, I would tear this household apart with my bare spectral hands. Chapter 6, The Survival. He survived. Somehow, impossibly, my 5-year-old son survived. The fever broke on the 7th day. He woke to find himself still tied to the tree, still freezing, still starving. But alive. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He just looked around with those patient eyes, took stock of his situation, and began to plan. I watched him through that first winter, and the spring that followed, and the summer, and the next winter. 10 years. 10 whole years of watching my son suffer. After the fever, they untied him from the tree but never gave him back his place in the household. He was moved to a tiny room in the servants' quarters, a windowless closet barely large enough for a bedroll. His meals were scraps from the kitchen, whatever the cooks felt like throwing his way. His clothes were discards from the servants' children, patched and repatched until the original fabric was barely visible. But the worst was the treatment. Lu Rumei's son, Pei Hong, made it his personal mission to torment Yuan'er. Every day brought new humiliations, dog food dumped on his head during meals, his bedrolls soaked with dirty water, accidental kicks and shoves in the corridors. The servants followed their young master's lead. They beat Yuan'er for the smallest infractions, for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, for looking at them wrong, for existing. They cursed him constantly, called him bastard to his face, made sure he knew exactly where he stood in the household pecking order. And his father? Pei Wenxuan never intervened. He walked past his son being beaten without a glance. He ate lavish meals while his son starved. He built a new life with his new wife and new son while his firstborn rotted in the servants' quarters. The one time Yuan'er dared approach him, a desperate plea for food, for warmth, for anything, Pei Wenxuan looked through him as if he didn't exist. Then he turned to a servant and said, calmly, remove this disturbance. The servant beat Yuan'er so badly he couldn't walk for a week. I watched all of this from above, my spectral form growing darker with every passing year. The rage that had filled me at my death didn't fade, it grew, feeding on every injustice, every cruelty, every moment of my son's suffering. But I also watched something else grow. Yuan'er's mind. Chapter 7, The Weed. They tried to keep him ignorant. No tutor would teach the household's abandoned child. No books were given to him. No education of any kind was permitted. But my son was like a weed struggling in the darkest corner, and weeds find a way. I watched him discover the crack under the library door, wide enough for a small boy to squeeze through. I watched him sneak in at night, when the household slept, to read by the thin light of the moon. Character by character. Word by word. Page by page. He devoured everything. History texts. Poetry collections. Philosophical treatises. Agricultural manuals. Military strategy. Anything with words, he read. When the library was locked at night, he listened at classroom windows while the tutors taught Pei Hong. He memorized every lesson, every recitation, every argument. When the tutors set essays for Pei Hong, Yuan'er wrote his own versions in secret, on scraps of paper he stole from the kitchen. When he ran out of paper, he wrote in charcoal on the walls of his tiny room, then washed them clean before dawn. When he ran out of books in the Pei library, he found ways to borrow from other households, trading small services for access, using his growing network of sympathetic servants and merchants. 10,000 books. By the time he was 18, my son had read 10,000 books. And he had learned something even more important than the knowledge they contained, patience. The patience of the weed that knows it cannot grow tall overnight. The patience of the prisoner who knows his jailers will eventually sleep. The patience of the avenger who knows his day will come. I watched him grow from a starving child into a lean, watchful young man. His face had lost its baby roundness, becoming sharp and angular. His eyes had lost their innocent brightness, becoming deep and unreadable. But sometimes, late at night, when he thought no one was watching, I saw something flicker in those eyes. The same boundless hatred I had seen on the day I died. It had never faded. It had only gone underground, waiting. Chapter 8, The Examination. The imperial examinations were held once every 3 years. They were the gateway to power, the path by which common scholars could rise to the highest ranks of government. Thousands competed. Only a handful passed. My son didn't just pass. He topped. First in the provincial examinations. First in the metropolitan examinations. First in the palace examinations. 3 times in a row. At 18, Pei Yuan became the youngest top scholar in the dynasty's history. The news spread through the capital like wildfire. The Pei family's abandoned son, the one everyone had forgotten, the one who had been treated worse than a dog, had achieved what no one else in a generation had achieved. And suddenly, everyone remembered him. The scholars who had ignored him now sought his company. The officials who had never heard of him now sent congratulations. The matchmakers who had never considered him now lined up outside the Pei estate. Including his father. Chapter 9, The Reunion. Pei Wenxuan showed up at Yuaner's door 3 days after the results were announced. He had aged in the 10 years since my death, gray at his temples, lines around his eyes. But he still carried himself with the same arrogant dignity, the same assumption that the world owed him respect. He stood at the entrance to Yuaner's tiny room in the servants' quarters, the same room where my son had suffered for a decade, and smiled. A smile. As if 10 years of neglect could be erased by a smile. As if 10 years of beatings could be forgotten because his son had finally become useful. Yuaner, he said, his voice warm with false fatherly affection. I've come to take you home. The main house, I mean. You shouldn't be living in these conditions. Not anymore. You're a top scholar now. You belong with your family. I floated above them, my spectral form trembling with rage. This man. This murderer. This father who had watched his son suffer for 10 years without lifting a finger. And now he wanted to take him home. Yuaner looked at his father. Just looked. For a long, terrible moment, neither of them spoke. Then Yuaner reached into his sleeve and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Pei Wenxuan without a word. I drifted closer, reading over his shoulder. Just 8 words, written in my son's elegant calligraphy. The day you cut ties, all debts were paid. Pei Wenxuan's face went pale. He read the words again. And again. His hands, which had pushed me to my death, trembled slightly. Yuaner, he said, his voice no longer warm. What is this? Yuaner smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. Father, he said, the title dripping with sarcasm, surely you remember. 10 years ago, when you had my mother murdered and left me to die in this courtyard, you made your position very clear. I was no longer your son. I was nothing. A bastard. A weed to be trampled. I never said. You didn't have to say it. Yuaner's voice was calm, terrifyingly calm. Your actions spoke loudly enough. 10 years, father. 10 years of hunger. 10 years of beatings. 10 years of watching you build a new life with my mother's murderer while I rotted in this hole. Pei Wenxuan's face contorted. Your mother was guilty of. My mother was innocent. The words cut through the air like a blade. Yuaner stepped forward, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that made even me, a ghost, draw back. It was the hatred I had seen on the day I died. But grown. Fed by 10 years of suffering, 10 years of planning, 10 years of waiting. It was patient hatred. Calculated hatred. The kind of hatred that could wait 10 more years if necessary, 100, 1,000, because it knew, with absolute certainty, that its day would come. You had her killed, Yuaner said softly, so you could marry your mistress. You framed her for crimes she didn't commit. You drowned her like a dog and made me watch. You made me watch. The silence stretched between them. Then Yuaner stepped back, his face smoothing into polite emptiness. Thank you for coming, father. But as I said, the day you cut ties, all debts were paid. I owe you nothing. And you, his eyes flickered, owe me everything. He turned and walked away, leaving Pei Wenxuan standing alone in the doorway of that tiny, miserable room. I floated after my son, my heart, if ghosts have hearts, swelling with pride. He knew. He had always known. And he had been waiting. Chapter 10, The Reckoning. What came after was even more satisfying. Yuaner didn't just walk away from his father. He destroyed him. Piece by piece. Slowly. Carefully. With the patience of a man who had spent 10 years learning exactly how to wait. First, Lu Rume. Yuan'er had spent years gathering evidence. Documents, witnesses, testimonies, everything needed to prove how she had framed me for crimes I didn't commit. The forged letters. The planted evidence. The bribed servants. The false witnesses at my trial. He presented it all to the authorities on the same day he accepted his official position. The investigation was swift. The evidence was overwhelming. The verdict was unanimous. Lu Rume was sentenced to death by 1,000 cuts, the same death she had arranged for me, only slower. I watched her execution from above, floating among the clouds. She screamed for hours. I felt nothing. Then, Pei Wenxuan. Yuan'er didn't just expose his crimes, he exposed everything. The corruption in his official duties. The bribes he had accepted. The cases he had manipulated. The lives he had destroyed. The investigation revealed that my murder wasn't his only crime. It was just the beginning. He was stripped of his position, his titles, his honors. Everything he had spent a lifetime building, gone in an instant. Then he was tried for my murder. The evidence was clear. The verdict was inevitable. Exile. Forever. Never allowed to return to the capital. On the day he left, chained to a convoy of other criminals, I floated down to watch. He looked old now. Broken. The arrogant dignity that had defined him was gone, replaced by the hollow eyes of a man who had lost everything. As his chains rattled past the gates of the capital, he looked back. I don't know what he was looking for. His son's forgiveness? A second chance? Mercy? He found none. The entire Pei family collapsed overnight. The household that had murdered me, that had tortured my son, that had built itself on lies and cruelty, gone. The servants scattered. The properties were seized. The name that Pei Wenxuan had valued so highly became a byword for disgrace. And Yuan'er? Yuan'er stood at the pinnacle of power, becoming the most powerful minister in the court. Chapter 11, The Emptiness. But he grew less and less happy. I had expected him to find peace after the revenge. I had expected the hatred in his eyes to finally fade, replaced by satisfaction, by closure, by the ability to move on. It didn't. The hatred faded, yes. But nothing came to fill the space it left behind. Just emptiness. Every night, when all was quiet, he would come to the courtyard where I once lived, the same courtyard where he had been tied to the locust tree as a child, where he had frozen and starved and nearly died. He would sit there until dawn. He never spoke. Just sat there, quietly, staring at nothing. I floated beside him night after night, watching his increasingly gaunt face, watching the exhaustion and loneliness in his eyes that nothing could dissolve. He had achieved everything. Power, wealth, respect, revenge. But he had no one to share it with. The mother who had loved him was gone. The father who should have loved him was worse than gone. The childhood he should have had was stolen. The family he could have built seemed impossible. How could he trust anyone enough to love them, after what love had cost him? I wanted to tell him, Yuan'er, Mom is here. I wanted to wrap my spectral arms around him and never let go. I wanted to wipe away the loneliness that had become a permanent part of his expression. But he couldn't hear me. He couldn't feel me. He sat alone in that courtyard night after night, and I sat beside him, and neither of us could reach the other. Chapter 12, The Rain. Until that night. It was raining, a cold, driving rain that soaked through everything and turned the world gray. The kind of rain that had fallen on the day I died. Yuan'er came to the courtyard as always, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him walked a procession of workers carrying stones, tools, lanterns. He was rebuilding my tomb. The original tomb, if you could call it that, had been a crude affair. A simple marker in a forgotten corner of the Pei family cemetery, placed there by servants who had been ordered to deal with the body. No ceremony. No respect. Just a hole in the ground and a stone with my name hastily carved. Now, 10 years later, my son was giving me a proper resting place. Marble. Fine carvings. A proper altar. Space for incense and offerings. He directed the workers himself, his voice quiet but firm, his eyes never leaving the stone that would bear my name. They worked through the night, the rain soaking them all, the lanterns flickering but never dying. When it was done, the workers left. Yuan'er stayed. He approached the new tombstone slowly, his steps heavy with exhaustion. When he reached it, he didn't kneel. He collapsed. He lay against my gravestone, his arms wrapped around it like a child clutching his mother, and he cried. Not the quiet tears of a man in control. Not the dignified grief of a minister who had to maintain his composure. He cried like a child. Like the 5-year-old boy who had watched his mother drown and had never, in 10 years, been allowed to grieve. Mom. His voice broke on the word, barely audible above the rain. Mom. I miss you so much. All these years. I'm so tired. I did everything. I got revenge. I destroyed them. I made them pay. But it's not. He couldn't finish. He just lay there against the cold stone, his body shaking with sobs, the rain mixing with his tears until they were indistinguishable. I floated above him, watching, my spectral form trembling with an emotion I couldn't name. Then, without thinking, I reached out. I wanted to touch his head. Just once. Just to let him know, somehow, some way, that he wasn't alone. My hand reached toward his wet hair. And this time, it landed. I felt it. The wet strands of his hair against my spectral fingers. The warmth of his scalp beneath. The slight tremor as he sensed something, someone, there. He looked up. His reddened eyes, swollen from crying, searched the empty air around him. They were confused, hopeful, terrified, all at once. Mom? He whispered. Are you here? I couldn't speak. I could barely breathe, if ghosts breathe. But I had to. I had to say something. Yuan'er, I whispered, my voice barely a breath on the wind. Don't be afraid. Live well. He heard me. I saw it in his eyes, the moment the sound reached him, the moment he understood. Live for yourself. Mom will watch over you from heaven. His tears fell harder, but now they were different. Not the tears of grief and exhaustion, but the tears of release. Of finally, after 10 years, being seen. Mom. Mom. He reached out, trying to find me, but his hands passed through empty air. I was already fading. The effort of touching him, of speaking to him, had used something I didn't know I had. My spectral form was dissolving, breaking apart like morning mist in sunlight. But I wasn't afraid. I had said what I needed to say. He had heard me. He knew. As I dissolved into specks of starlight, scattered in the wind and rain, I watched my son's face. The loneliness was still there. It would probably always be there, a scar that never fully healed. But for the first time in 10 years, he was smiling. A real smile. The smile of a child who had finally found his mother. Chapter 13, The Life. Later, I heard. From somewhere beyond, from the whispers of other spirits who had crossed over, I learned what happened after. Yuan'er married. A gentle woman from a good family, chosen not for political advantage but for the kindness in her eyes. She never asked about his past. She never pushed him to talk about the loneliness that sometimes crept back into his expression. She simply stayed, quietly, patiently, until the loneliness faded a little more each year. They had children. 3 of them, 2 boys and a girl. He named the girl after me. He taught them everything, not just books and poetry, but how to be kind. How to be strong. How to be patient. How to wait for the right moment, and how to act when it came. He rose higher and higher in the court, becoming the most powerful minister in the dynasty. Emperors came and went, but Pei Yuan remained, the steady hand guiding the empire, the wise counselor whose advice was sought by all. But he never forgot. Every year, on the anniversary of my death, he would visit my tomb. He would bring incense and offerings, and he would sit there for hours, just talking. Telling me about his life. His family. His hopes. His fears. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon was full and the wind was still, I think he felt me there. A presence. A warmth. A whisper on the air. He lived to 80. Surrounded by sons and grandsons, students across the land, his name remembered and respected throughout the empire. On his deathbed, when the family gathered around him, weeping, he looked into the void above them. And he smiled. Like a child. Mom, I'm here. His eyes closed. His breathing stopped. And somewhere beyond, I was waiting. Chapter 14, The Reunion. I don't remember crossing over. One moment, I was watching my son's body grow still, the weeping family gathered around him. The next, I was somewhere else. A garden. Endless and beautiful, filled with flowers that bloomed in impossible colors, with trees whose leaves shimmered like jewels, with light that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. And walking toward me through the garden was a young man. Not the tired, aged minister I had watched for so many years. Not the gaunt, lonely young man who had sat in courtyards through countless nights. A young man. Strong. Healthy. With eyes that held all the wisdom of his long life, but a face that was young and unlined. He was smiling. Mom. That voice. That word. Spoken with a lifetime of love compressed into a single syllable. I ran to him. And for the first time in 13 years, I held my son. Chapter 15, The End. They say that life is a river, and death is the ocean where all rivers meet. I don't know about that. What I know is this. I died on a bitterly cold day in early winter, pushed to my death by the man I loved. I watched my son suffer for 10 years, unable to help, unable to comfort, unable to do anything but watch. I watched him rise from the ashes of his childhood to become something greater than anyone could have imagined. I watched him avenge me, and then I watched him learn to live. And at the end of it all, when the river finally reached the ocean, I was there to meet him. That is the story I bought with my life. 13 years of watching. 13 years of waiting. 13 years of loving from beyond the grave. Was it worth it? Every moment. Every agonizing, heartbreaking, rage-filled moment. Because at the end of it all, I got to hold my son again. And that, I think, is the only happy ending that matters. I am Shin Qingning. A ghost who's been dead for 13 years. This is the story I bought with my life. Thank you for listening.